Welcome to Chapter 2, The Rise of Empires and the Beginning of the Iron Age. And we're going to pick up where we left off after the first intermediate period. So we have some key questions we're going to talk about. Unity and division in a civilization. And we're going to see there are complications that come with civilized life. And that we talked about a little bit about the creation of personalized identity or personal identity, thinking of yourself and giving yourself an identity as part of a group or part of a family. And that's what they mean by creation of multiple identities. I'm part of this family, part of this city state. I have an identity as part of multiple things. And civilization we see is the most highly developed form of cultural behavior on which we pin survival. So culture actually relates to what it takes to be to actually stay alive. And the values that unite a civilization and the differences, even small ones, can set people against each other. It doesn't have to be a large difference that can start a war. It can be something very small to an outside group. New powerful empires are created in the second millennium BCE, but there are a lot of forces of instability that are created as well. So we'll see that these empires rise and fall often very quickly. Let's see, this picture, this is Ramses II, so from Egypt. There are transition state period, 2004 BCE, we see Sumer's last government is overthrown by the Elamites, but they can't maintain the urban institutions. Sumer had a lot of city-state government-type institutions, and the Elamites weren't prepared to maintain all of that. And as Sumer declines, the Assyrians begin to establish a city-state, but they're not a threat just yet. They're just starting to amass a state, which will become a threat in the future. The immediate successor to the Sumerians are the Amorites, and they actually found the city of Babylon, and then they start extending their power through much of the Middle East. The Babylonian Empire actually was largely a creation of the king Hammurabi, and he's a creator of a famous code called Hammurabi's Code. It's what is most known for. He unified a diverse and large empire, and the large empire with a diverse population in Mesopotamia. There were a series of conquests over 30 years, and there was instability in the region. He unified that region through a common law code with justice defined, and he enforced it. So basically, he wrote a law code that was to be enforced by judges as if what he wanted them to do if it were him. So the features of the code was a common standard of justice, and it broke down cultural barriers that would divide the king's subjects because it was such a large empire. The legal rights were determined by class standing. There was a sliding scale of punishment depending on, there was a different standard for the rich and for the poor. The punishment took on the form of fines, mutilations, and executions. There weren't jails or any place to really hold these criminals, so that was the consequences. It followed the biblical idea of an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. So if a builder built a house and it fell and killed the son of the owner, then the son of the builder would be killed and as a consequence. So it was very much what you did is what happened to you. There was a concern for the poor, the weak, and the enslaved shown in the code. So it was more showed a concern for everyone in the empire in that sense. There were property rights for women in the code, but it was limited because it was a patriarchal society. This is the Hammurabi's Code. Hammurabi giving out his code. They also made advances in science, particularly in math and astronomy. The Babylonians used the decimal, base 10, and the sexagesimal, base 60 system. And we see that system in our 60-second minute, our 60-minute hour, the 360 degrees in a circle. Astrology and astronomy, they didn't see a difference between those two things, and they combined, so they're kind of combined. They took very minute and accurate observations about the heavens and heavenly movements, and that allowed for improvements in the calendar because of the data that they gathered. Hammurabi's empire began to fall away shortly after his death. It held on for another 150 years, but it wasn't the same after he died. In 1595, the city fell to the Hittites, but they came really to loot it and not to conquer it. They weren't actually conquerors. After the Hittites retreated, the Kassites moved down from the Zagros Mountains with the plan to occupy Babylon, Akkad, and Sumer. They ruled for 600 years, and they guarded the cultural legacy of the area. They restored temples, they built libraries, and they spread the knowledge of cuneiform through the region. As far as ancient Egypt is concerned, we see that there was the collapse of the Old Kingdom, leading to that led to the first intermediate period, and that leads to 2 centuries of division and upheaval. A dynasty was restored a few years before the fall of Sumer and survived to the sack of the Babylon by the Hittites, making the Middle Kingdom pharaohs contemporaries of Hammurabi. And that Middle Kingdom we talked about in the last chapter. We'll talk about it again now. The Middle Kingdom was an era of prosperity, creativity, and literary achievement. Pharaohs still charged with enforcing justice and defending the poor, but they were less remote from the people than was common in the Old Kingdom. Remember, in the Old Kingdom, pharaohs were the embodiment of the gods here on earth. Now you see the pharaohs are call themselves shepherds, so they're less remote to the people. Many of the structures of the Middle Kingdom were torn down to build grander structures in the later kingdom, but their literary achievements were more lasting. The Middle Kingdom was founded by a warrior from Thebes in Upper Egypt. The pharaohs again seemed less remote. They were called shepherds again. They were praised for defending the poor and equitably enforcing justice. They extended their power up into Nubia. They sponsored trade to distant lands. They dug canals and improved irrigation projects. So they were seen as more into economic development than into grand spending on pyramids and things for themselves. Many tombs of officials indicate wealth was more widely distributed, and the wealthy officials did have pyramids and tombs for themselves. So it shows that money was spread out more than just in the house of the king or the pharaoh. And the cult of Osiris and Isis flourished during this time. There was an extremely literary productivity. There are lots of writings, and much of it survives today. The things that they wrote were morally edifying tales and proverbs. They praised the just and condemned those who exploited the vulnerable. They advised modesty, hard work, loyalty, and deference to superiors. But they also warned young men to treat women well. They warned about the dangers of not treating women well. But they fell to invaders called the Hyksos, which means foreigners, in the 17th and 16th centuries BCE. That led to the second intermediate period. And it's not really certain why the Egyptians fell to the Hyksos. Perhaps they had new military technology, and it was the technology gap between the Egyptians and the Hyksos. We're not really sure. Another theory sees the Hyksos, there's a migration of foreigners. There may have been a food shortage that led to a great migration, and the infrastructure wasn't prepared to handle so many people. And this leads to a disintegration in the Egyptian central government. But Upper Egypt divided into a lot of little areas held by different Egyptian chiefs. But eventually one leader from Thebes reunites Egypt. Lessons they learned from the Hyksos: that isolationism was unwise. They developed a sustained interest in the outside world. They embraced expansionism and began the conquest of an empire. So their new king was the pinnacle of Egyptian wealth and power. The involvement in cultural and military terms with the larger Middle East. Hatshepsut is the female pharaoh, And females couldn't technically rule. The female pharaohs that we see mostly ruled in the spot of a male, like a son who was not old enough to rule yet. You don't see very many females who rule on their own. And when you see depictions of them, they often have beards as if they are men, because technically they couldn't be pharaoh. So there were a lot of complex issues with a female ruling, although there are about 6 that actually ruled during Egyptian history. And then you'll see the military success and the highest level of cultural context come under Tutmosis III. Egypt was managed by an army of bureaucrats that were closely supervised by the pharaoh and the pharaoh's wife, to whom they reported. Egypt didn't plant colonies or occupy conquered lands. They would just periodically send military expeditions to keep those native princes that they left in control, to keep them in line. The Amarna period led to a religious change and a backlash, because they considered temples the private residences of the gods, and the priests had a lot of daily duties that were very elaborate they did in place of the pharaoh, because remember, the pharaoh is technically the chief representative of God here on earth, or the gods here on earth. So the temples were set up that way. They weren't for people to go and congregate and worship or anything like that. The temples were also a branch of government. The granaries that they had provided a food reserve that they could distribute in times of need. And Amun-Ra was the most popular god, and the priests in Amun-Ra were very important societal figures. And some of the priesthood became so wealthy that they could threaten the power of the pharaoh. At the end of Amenhotep III's reign, the temple of Amun-Ra had an endowment amounting to 1/4 of Egypt's arable land. So it was seen as a threat to the pharaoh, because it was so powerful. So Amenhotep IV made this attempt to overturn the established religious order. He closed temples, confiscated their property, and embraced a new god, the Aten, to whom only the pharaoh and his family were said to have direct access. So he eliminated the priests. A new name, Akhenaten, and a capital, Amarna, and new artistic standards were enforced. So he basically said no other gods are to be worshipped. We're all going to worship this one God, and I'm the only one who can access this God. And everything now belongs to me. So he's trying to eliminate this competition from the priests and take greater charge as the pharaoh. After he died, it was all destroyed. His name was they tried to eliminate his name. Amarna was abandoned. Nefertiti, his wife was seen as very beautiful. Everything about her was depicted as beautiful. There she is. Okay. After this period, we start seeing mismanagement of the kingdom, resistance by religious and political conservatives against Akhenaten. Then following him, we have the boy king, Tutankhamun, later Tutankhamun. His tomb was discovered in 1922. It was how we learned a lot about Egypt. You need to read that section in your book. And then we also see a lot of monuments raised by Ramses II. But there were new powers rising to threaten Egypt at this time. In Egyptian society, we see that despite the foreign nature, all the foreign threats, their society was rarely threatened the internal stability. Life stayed pretty much as is for the normal everyday person. There was security, a reliable economy, and the pharaohs were so rigidly in control that the Egyptians avoided some of the stresses internally that other societies felt. There were social classes, but most everyone were peasants, and there was very little social mobility. It was a mild patriarchy, but men and women of the same class had nearly identical rights. So if you were a noble, men and women of the noble class had basically the same rights. If you were a peasant, men and women of the peasant class had basically the same rights. Here's a map for you. Then we see the second intermediate period sees a lot of upheaval throughout the Middle East. Early in the second millennium BCE, we see peoples from somewhere north of the Black Sea that come from outward in all directions. And they take their language everywhere they go, and their language begins to take root. So a lot of modern languages have Indo-European roots, and that's why they have similarities. The Hittites become one of the powerful new states. They sacked Babylon in 1595 BCE, but they're not able to expand into Syria and Mesopotamia because of the Mitannians. However, the Hittites defeat the Mitannians in 1360 BCE and then move their eyes toward Egypt under Ramses II. They do actually make a peace accord with the Egyptians because the Assyrians have now managed to become liberated and become a threat, and the Hittites now have to turn their eyes towards the Assyrians. So it really isn't so much that the Egyptians are able to fight off the Hittites, and that the Hittites would have been able necessarily to defeat the Egyptians. It's that the Assyrians are the bigger threat, so the Hittites turn away from fighting the Egyptians and move their eyes toward the Assyrians. The Hittites adopt cuneiform and assimilate things from the other civilizations that are there. So they take what they like of whatever civilizations they conquer or come in contact with. The people live in isolated, self-sufficient villages, and they don't have very many major cities other than their capital. They were a warlike tribal society, and they were well mobilized to support their large, well-equipped army. The kings shared power with a council of chief families. This led to a lot of coups, assassinations, and dispute over who was to be the next leader. There was a widespread disruption and resettlement at the end of the 13th century, and we don't know if this was because of climate change, adaptations of military technology, or invasion of the sea peoples, or other factors. But Assyria rose in northern Mesopotamia to one of the major kingdoms, and there was a development of iron weapons. The Assyrians are one of the most violent peoples in history, and the Chaldean Empire also will come to play towards this period. So talking about the Assyrians, they advanced slowly due to internal political tension. But Tiglath-Pileser takes the throne in 1114 BCE. He subdues Babylon and drives through the Mediterranean. But again, Assyria declines after his death until the 9th century BCE. Then we get a new great city of Nimrud built in the south, near Nineveh, and this is one of the first sites explored by the European adventurers in the 19th century. After this, we have a disputed succession, then we have another decline, and then 745 BCE, there's a general, Tiglath-Pileser III. He seized power and builds a large empire. 722 BCE, Sargon II usurps or takes control from the throne from the ruler and founds the last and greatest Assyrian dynasty. His grandson Esarhaddon brought it to the height when it conquers Egypt. Egypt is fading in glory. The new kingdom begins to decline after raids by the sea people. Local strongmen break free of the central government and start making small states out of carving up Egypt, and that leaves them vulnerable to invasion because they don't have the strength of being a united country. Nubia, which Egypt had often invaded, now invades Egypt, but they went too far and were pushed out by the Assyrians. The Assyrians try to rule through native client rulers, so local Egyptians, but they were notoriously unreliable. And then in 655, there's governors of a place called Sais in Egypt. They restore unity and independence for the Egyptians. They sought out allies and trading partners and opened up Egypt to the outside world. Foreigners come and establish merchant colonies, serve the pharaohs as mercenaries, maybe to validate their rule, or maybe just kind of as a throwback. The pharaohs try to revive old practices and styles from the Old and Middle Kingdoms, and there was a literary renaissance. The culmination of Assyria during this time, they relied on brute force and psychological intimidation to build and hold its empire together. Their most significant contributions are in military science. They maintained a standing army consisting of specialized units. They had infantry, cavalry, chariots, scouts, and engineers, so they were very well developed in military science. They had iron weapons and armor that became common, and horse breeders actually made them large enough to be ridden into battle. Unlike a lot of armies that just basically kind of were scattered groups that attacked at random, their army was trained to execute battle plans. And they had support structures in place to keep their army well supplied during sieges and well supplied when they were on the move. Again, iron became increasingly common as iron ore was plentiful. Assyrian rulers basically resorted to terrorism to frighten their opponents into submission. They used beheadings, eye gougings, mutilations. They would flay the skin off their enemies. They were just horrible at, they were very good at keeping people scared to keep them in line. However, the empire was plagued by revolt and rebellion because they inspired no loyalty to their empire. Some regions were pacified because they would take large numbers of people and deport them and mix up the empire. So they would take a group of people from here and move them over there, take a group of people from over there and move them here, so that the people were all scattered around, so that you didn't necessarily have a reason to fight because you weren't at home. This is how the 10 lost tribes from the Bible were scattered. And this militarization of their society affected their law. Their laws were full of mutilation and execution as their punishments. Their peak came under Assurbanipal, who was a scholar and a general. He created the huge library at Nineveh that's very famous, but conditions deteriorated under his two sons. And there was just a lot of manpower that was required to keep watch over all the subjects that were so resentful of the central government. And this was probably a factor in their sudden collapse. They fell to the Chaldeans, who seized Babylon. The Chaldeans negotiated with the Medes to join forces against the Assyrians to sack Nineveh, and that's what happened. But by 610, the Assyrians were a memory, and the Chaldeans were rising in power. Now, the Chaldeans had a short-lived empire, and they're primarily remembered for their role in biblical history. They conquered Judah, destroyed Jerusalem and its temple, and forced the people into exile. And the people of Judah responded to this by focusing on the creation of Hebrew scriptures as a strategy to preserve their cultural identity, the rules of their cultic life, and memories of their past. So now we're going to talk a little bit about the Bible and its history. Because no ancient people had greater influence in what developed into what we call Western civilization than the peoples that are known by various names, the Hebrews, the Israelites, and the Jews. All three of the West's major religions, Judaism, Islam, and Christianity, trace their origins to this group at least partially. The exalted nature of the Hebrews' God and the contrast of their religious sensibilities very much were against what their neighbors believed. They believed in one God that was concerned about individuals, whereas the others believed in multiple gods who did not have any concern for the individual. Let's see. Palestine was relatively insignificant during this period, and you can read about the findings of the archaeologists and the difficulties the textbook says the Hebrews have with the historical data. This is a chart that compares the Egypt and the biblical narrative, the Babylonian Empire, so you can see where things fall in a timeline of comparison. The Phoenicians are one of our next big groups, and they're the first notable seafarers. And there were several groups that settled along the eastern edge of the Mediterranean, but the Phoenicians are the richest. And they derived their wealth from trade because their ports were really well suited to mediate trade between Egypt and Mesopotamia. They're actually explorers traveling all along the Mediterranean, colonizing the coast of North Africa, and they even went as far as Atlantic, and there's perhaps evidence that they went as far as England. They diffused civilization throughout the Mediterranean world, and their influence lives on through the alphabet that went to Greece and then to Rome and then even to today. In exile, we're going to talk about the preservation of Jewish identity. The deportation of the Jews in the kingdom of Judah to Babylon in 587 BCE. We talked about that a little bit before, about how the Jews were exiled under the Chaldeans. It was short-lived. The Jews were restored by Cyrus the Great in 539 BCE. We talked about they created a Hebrew scripture, the Torah, and that may have just been a way to write down their oral tradition into one narrative. And they read the first reading of the Torah in Jerusalem after they came back from exile in Babylon. This is a map of, you can see Israel, Judah, Phoenicia, Philistia, some of the major areas during this time. The axial age in religion, we call it this because it's an axis. The development of Jewish religion concepts parallels development in many other world civilizations. So we have Greek philosophers that are thinking about the world, why it is the way it is, Zoroastrian religious reform in Persia, Confucius in China, Buddha is developing in India. And then we have Hebrew prophets who are not so much like seeing the future as interpreting events, and moral teachers in Palestine. So there's like a huge axis in religion going on worldwide at this time. So key questions we're going to revisit. There's small political entities that give way to great land masses under centralized control. Complexities of controlling large groups of diverse people. Should a monarch concern for maintaining control? What should that look like? And enforcing justice. Is that a king's prerogative or is it a universal concept? So just some things to think about. And that is the end of chapter 2.